Welcome to Trust Talks. I'm your host, Robert Porter Lynch. For 5 decades, I've been focused on finding better ways for people to work together in teams, organizations, and strategic alliances. Today, we're here with Steve Rogers, a thought leader in supply management, a noted author, and also an expert in collaborative innovation. Please meet Steve Rogers.
You're not a typical supply chain manager. You've really taken a very strategic view to it and a very relationship view to it and figured out new ways to think through the whole way supply management can produce tremendous value. And while you were at P&G, you were able to create a lot of innovation. You were able to get people to work together across the supply chain. And this is an opportunity for you to tell a few stories about how things really happen in the real world and the power of trust and relationships. So I'd like to just let you talk about all those things that you've done with a couple of stories.
Woven in?
Yeah, woven in. So
Okay.
Take it away, Steve.
Alrighty, thank you, Robert. Often supply chains, the senior management of the company thinks that it's a cost center, so all you want to do is squeeze money out of the cost center. And at P&G we figured out that that's not the case. It's true, there's a lot of collaboration benefits that come along with it. And the one everyone always thinks about is new products. And in our case, we went through a period of time where our R&D people were developing products that consumers loved. The problem was that the design was too expensive. And most people don't understand that 80% of the cost of a product is baked in at the beginning. And there's nothing anybody can do about it. So you're tinkering with that last 20%. It means it's designed into the product. It's how it was designed. And so the only way that you can address that is if you set up early commercial and technical interface. And so the first thing we had to do was get an alliance with our own product development and R&D people. And in a lot of companies, that's hard to do. But the senior management of R&D had brought several really good products to market and had them fail because they were too expensive. And at the same time, we'd been trying to get in early and been resisted by the lower and middle levels of R&D. And finally, the tops of the two, the purchasing and the R&D people, got together. And R&D said, look, we need some help earlier in the process so that when the product comes out of the oven, it is now priced such that a consumer would want to buy it. And that was kind of the entree of an internal alliance. One comment I'd make is, usually if you're dealing with a supplier or a customer, the party opposite you on the table, the only reason they're talking to you is they have some interest in doing business with you. So at least you have some way to form a collaborative relationship, or even a transactional one, because they want to sell to you. Internally, the reward systems of the different functions are so different that oftentimes there's nothing in it for the other group if they cooperate with you. And I found that internal alliances are harder to set up than external alliances. But in this case, R&D needed something from us and we needed something from them. And the result was that we began to work earlier with them. And there's a lot of stories about that I could tell. One I'll talk about is the Swiffer. Now today the Swiffer is about a $1 billion business. And P&G had never made a product with any kind of what we called an implement. So if you think of the original Swiffer, that's like the mop handle, okay? And the product business model is sort of like razor blades and the razor. You sell this in the original, but what really matters is the non-woven that picks up the dirt on the bottom, and you sell refills. So it's very much like razors and blades. And so the situation was that we figured no consumer would ever buy that. And we didn't have anybody who was buying that kind of stuff. So we're sitting there and it was, what do we do? What else folds up and changes shape And at that particular point in time, the toy industry brought out Transformers. And if you guys remember Transformers, you made an airplane became like a car, became something else. So we went to the toy industry and we said, hey, we're trying to do something. How do you guys make this stuff so it's affordable? And they said, well, we actually don't make it. We have a contract manufacturer in China. We have vetted them. We'll introduce you to them. They can help you design it such that it doesn't cost very much. And oh, by the way, there are subcontractors who do all of the molding and the other things that go with it. You can go to them and make sure there's no child labor, no safety issues, no prisoner labor, all the things that you hear about from low-cost country sources. So we did end up getting together with that supplier. They have a couple of times over the years got an award for being one of our best suppliers. And they designed a handle that cost 1/3 of what the cost was for our R&D handle. So we used theirs, of course, and the rest was history.
Tell me a little bit about what the relationship was with that supplier. What did that supplier do? What was the trust level that you had? And how did you keep that kind of relationship going? And why did they give you the innovation and not one of your competitors?
Well, that one is pretty simple. We were the first guys to show up and ask them to do it. That's why they gave it to us, because there wasn't anybody else who wanted to take that kind of a product globally. There was a few of those sold in Japan by another company, but it was not outside of the local Japanese market, and we were the ones who were going to go global. But the trust level was improved by, we were real clear about our expectations and also what we thought the business would be, where we thought it could go, but that there were some risks. The supplier, the transparency that he had about his supply chain, I think really reassured us. That and the fact that a couple of toy companies had said, look, these guys are honest to work with, they're good to work with. And we have a business in China, so we have some people on the ground there. And so we were able to have both the Cincinnati R&D people, Cincinnati people, and some of our Chinese people integrate and talk with the management of that company. So that's how it happened.
One thing that really impressed me about this entire way that you've operated is that you actually asked for innovation. Can you compare what happened before your regime at Procter Gamble, when you had vendor relationships and it was just 3 bids and a buy, versus what we started to do together to create the innovation flow from the supply chain?
I think the biggest difference, and a lot of that is broken down in a lot of industries today, but the biggest difference was we had a not invented here. It was kind of like if our R&D guys didn't think it up, it probably wasn't that good an idea. So there was a genuine resistance to taking anything from anyone else. And at the time, A.G. Lafley came in as the first CEO and realized that we really needed more innovation. And one of the places we can get it is our supply chain, because suppliers know their customers pretty well. And all of these suppliers have an R&D organization, whether it's the chemical people or the packaging people. So I think the difference was we would go to the supplier with an innovation and say, make this for us. But in the new world, which we called Connect and Develop, we went to the supplier and said, we'll keep doing that, but in addition, you bring us stuff that you think we could use in a product. And many of these appliances, or these suppliers, were supplier alliances. We'd been doing the design a molecule and they'd make it for you for many years, so we had close relationships with them. But what changed was more of an opening of the R&D facility. So if any of you are parents and you had your little boy or little girl write on the wall, maybe you've used a Mr. Clean eraser. And what happened there was we were in a supplier's research labs, and there was a purchasing person and an R&D person walking down the lab. Again, this alliance went all the way down into the organization, and so they were showing us stuff, and in one of them somebody was like had a a rough one, and they were taking a stain off the wall, and we're like, well, what's that? And they said, well, it's this, but we really don't have many people interested in it. And we said, well, tell you what, let us take that back. Our R&D guys were like, wow, it's a good idea, we can do this. There was some tweaking that went on, and the result was a Mr. Clean eraser, which is, it's probably, I don't know how big it is, but maybe $250 million, $500 million business today. And so that's the kind of innovation you get. We would never, and interestingly, a few years later, they said, well, we showed you the molecule, 5-10 years ago, but we didn't know what to do with it, and we didn't know to make it in a solid, and you guys looked at it, and you really weren't thinking about a block that you used to scrub walls, and so you guys said, we don't know. But generally speaking, that's kind of how it went. And so
in many ways, this is almost like your version of the Post-it note story.
yeah.
Yeah, this is BASF and Procter Gamble essentially having their own version of Post-it notes. Nobody knew what to do with the glue, and
until later.
And so you got a Post-it note, and you got a $500 million.
And they were fooling around with it, and they were the ones who put it in a solid. And we said, well, we'll have to do a few things to it. And so that's how it worked.
So you kind of co-created it together.
Yeah.
The final version of it.
Yeah.
So Steve, an important thing here that came out of the work that we did together at Procter & Gamble was, if you recall back when you invited me to talk to the senior executives that were coming in from all over the world. And you remember there are 3 questions that we asked at the very, very beginning?
Yeah,
Talk
I do.
a little bit about those 3 questions and what the outcome was and how the industry has changed.
Okay. Essentially, when Robert came in, he began his presentation with, do you think the supply chain is strategic? And some people raised their hand and some other ones didn't. But then he said, how much of your cost runs through the supply chain? And for us then, it was probably about 70%. For most companies, depending on if you're in the service industry or a hard goods industry, it ranges from 90-something% to probably 30%. That is a lot of money running through one system. The second thing is that he asked, or it was really the third thing he asked, was how much innovation. Now in those days, it was interesting. The people in that room said 2-3%. I had also seen about 10% from some people below them but what we decided was we needed a program called Connect and Develop. It was not R&D per se, it was connect with other people's R&D and develop. And by a year later, 30% of our innovation was from outside the company. It went up to 70% by 3 years later. But the interesting thing was most of the other companies in the industry already were ahead of us because they weren't as resistant to outside change. And so but then they suddenly found themselves behind us. In today's world, if you go to a Unilever and you ask them, they're getting 70-80% of their innovation. So the whole industry moved to that kind of connect and develop thing. Now, one of the measures that we had for that was we went to our suppliers and we asked them, how many people in your R&D organization are dedicated to our business? And when we added it up, it was about 8,000 or 9,000 people. Our entire research organization was 8,000 or 9,000 people. So we essentially doubled our resources in R&D by working with our supply base. So when we started out, we were getting between 5 and 10% of our innovation from outside the company, from our suppliers. And this connect and development system caused us to really focus on that and break down the barriers to outside ideas. Within a year, we were at almost 30%. Within 2 years, 50. Within 3, 65. And today, it's above 70. It's 70 to 80%. But what was interesting is the rest of the industry did the same thing. Because when a leader changes a system and gets an advantage, the other people will have to match it. And they found that their supply bases had a lot of innovation in them too. And so the entire industry today is probably 70 to 80% outside ideas driving their innovation.
So Steve, one of the relationships that you had was with a company called Novozymes, and they had a very sophisticated methodology for actually doing innovation. And most people, when they hear the expression Tide, the new improved Tide, they think that's just a bunch of marketing hooey, But in reality, they're pumping in a whole lot of new technology every single year to create new capacity for that Tide actually to get better and better every year. Most consumers don't understand that. Would you talk a little bit about Novozymes, what you learned from them, and how you had a relationship with them, and the power of that, the trusting relationship and the outcome?
That's a good story. We did have a good relationship with them, and it's a multi-year long alliance that's gone on for, I would bet 3 decades. And we worked with them, but they actually put together what a process was for their innovation work when they were working with us. Because at that time they basically said, you guys are the best company we work with, so we decided to put a process together, and they showed it to us. We were like, wow, is that what we've been doing? And they were like, yes, absolutely. And they gave us the process, which we then used ourselves to kind of systematize some of the things we were doing. But the interesting thing from a human angle is that all the levels of management are involved. And so we had a woman who was like a level 2 manager in purchasing who owned that relationship from the commercial side. And she was operating with some R&D people who were a little higher, which was fine. And the people at Novozymes came to really trust her. Her name was Nathalie Landru. And she got to be known by the CEO of their company, by many of the directors in their company, and they came to trust her. And when we had big issues and our senior management needed to talk to them, she was always the one who we always would make sure that she was there opening the door, so that her position with Novozymes was not undermined by some unexpected communications from elsewhere. And it was very interesting. We came up with a new product improvement. It was a new enzyme. And Novozyme came to us and they said, look, we really value this person. And remember, this is a lower level employee. This is like it's not an entry level, but it's like an experienced, but operational, doing the work, hands-on kind of person. And they said, we would like to name this product commercially after one of your people. And we're like, really? And they said, absolutely. And so they named that enzyme Natalase or Natalase, which is kind of the vernacular in the business. We'd never seen a company do that before. And it was pretty cool because it exemplifies the kind of relationship we had with them.
Steve, there's another story that you told me that I think demonstrates the power of trust, and it was right after Hurricane Katrina. And you're in the coffee part of the procurement angle, and tell us a little bit about what happened when Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005.
I'd be happy to. Actually, I was out of coffee by then and had transferred. I'd just come close to retiring at that point. And when I was in the coffee business, we set up a very integrated coffee supply chain. We built a silo, first one in North America. They do that a lot in Brazil and in Europe. We had a European supplier that helped us do it. And the Folgers business, which P&G has since sold to Smuckers, was their largest plant was in New Orleans. And I had been the manufacturing director there, so we had anti-hurricane planning processes. And in fact, they worked pretty well because after the hurricane, our plant was the first manufacturing plant in that region up and running. But it took a while. But what was interesting, if you think of a supply base as kind of a big ecosystem, so you have the coffee guys, you have the shipping guys, you have people making cans, packaging, all of that kind of stuff coming together. After that hurricane hit, our ability to make the coffee was 70% wiped out. So we would have been out of business. And it was our supply base, as well as our own people, getting our plant back up and running. But it was our supply base who did things both on the cost side and the supply side, which really saved us. We diverted ships from New Orleans to Houston, and you have to understand these seatainers that carry the coffee have a very high demurrage cost. So every day you hold it longer, it costs you a lot of money. The shippers came to us and said, "You're a partner. We will not charge you any demurrage. Let's take the stuff off, put it in Houston. We'll hold it for you, and we'll ship it to you when you can start production again." We estimate that saved us $1 million. We had changed from a metal can to a plastic can, if you will, which you now see on the stores. So we had left the metal can industry behind. And the two molding plants that made those cans were both knocked out by Katrina as well. And the metal can industry came back to us and said, "Look, we still have all the blueprints, all your artwork. We will sell you metal cans in the interim if you want to get back in business." Well, at that point in time, we also had a contract manufacturer or two, and they picked up some of the production. And then as we came back in production, we started off with metal cans. Now, those companies knew we weren't going to stay with them, but when we left those relationships, we left very gracefully. You know, they understood why we were leaving, and there wasn't a lot of hard feelings, and they stepped up and they helped us through this crisis. This happened again and again and again. The warehouse operators in the city of New Orleans who weren't knocked out took up some of the activities. Now, the other thing that was interesting is when I was working on the silo, one of the things that I went to bat for was we needed flood walls around the silo down in the port. And that added a 7-figure amount to the project. So, of course, management was like, "Well, do you really need that?" But eventually we won out. And while I was watching on TV, a helicopter went over the top of the area around the 9th Ward and the port and some of those places. And they looked down on our silo. And behind the seawall, it was the only thing that wasn't underwater. And people from the neighborhood we had let in, and they were all inside the seawall. So we actually helped a lot of people who otherwise would have been in far more danger. It wasn't just the business. There were also some very interesting things that happened. And I want to extend this, and I don't know if any of you remember the Kobe earthquake. I think it was 96. And we had been in Kobe that day, and we had just left for China. We got into China, and of course, CNN, which was on TV in China, said, "Hey, bad things have happened back in Japan." And we looked at the TV, and it was like, uh-oh. And our organization there was where we couldn't do business where we were. We had a 26-story building, and if you know anything about how the Japanese build buildings, they build them to resist earthquakes. This thing had a crack all the way up the center of the building. So that was a really bad earthquake. I don't remember how many thousand people were killed. But what happened was I was there, and the director from Japan was there, who was really the Asian director. And he went back to work there, and I stayed an extra amount of time to kind of run his operation while he was working back in Japan to get back in business. And afterwards he told me, "You know, Steve, our operation was on an island just off the coast, and our people were trapped on the island because many of them were in condos and things right around the plant, and they couldn't get off the island, and of course no food was there. And we had a supplier who was one of our key suppliers who was in cosmetic business. They supplied cosmetic packaging, and the senior executive said, "I have 2 ships They're not, big giant ships, but they were good-sized boats. I will ferry your people off the island, because we knew where we could take them somewhere in Kobe, but we couldn't get them off the island. And so this supplier lent us his boats. We took our people off. He then opened up one of his factories, and when our people got to the factory, he fed them a hot meal before we relocated them into places that they could live. And I think what happens is, if you have those kinds of relationships, whether it was a hurricane or an earthquake, the suppliers who know you come and support you. And so this whole ecosystem idea that's coming to the fore today, it's been there for a long time. Supply chains are ecosystems. It's just a fancier word that everybody's excited about but the truth is that those people rally and help each other because they know, A, they know the people, and B, they know the business is at risk. So you have kind of these two things coming together, and it becomes very powerful in an emergency.
Those are great stories, Steve. Could you compare that with other forms of supply relationship that don't have that relationship and trust built in, particularly transactional ones where it's just, buying over the internet, or 3 bids and then a buy, or adversarial ones like we saw in the automobile industry, particularly in the 1990s but went through into the 2000s. Can you compare high trust with transactional and adversarial relationships?
Okay. Well, I think the high trust one I just described, it's really the entire group rallies around the crisis or whatever it is, or your business, and they help you through it. I think the transactional, there's a little bit of that, because the people do business with you. It's like going to the grocery store. If I'm in a hurricane, I'm really happy if the grocery store has laid in a bunch of extra water and a bunch of extra stuff that I don't have to cook because there's probably no power, and I can go there and they don't run out in the first 2 hours. So there is something there, and of course they get a lot of business if they help you. I think the adversarial, I'm not going to say the adversarial remains adversarial. I don't think it does when you're in those situations, but it's every man for himself. It's basically, I'm going to cover myself, and if I'm covered, now I'll worry about somebody else and maybe help them out. I think most humans in a bad situation help each other, but it's the priority around which you help. And so I think with a trust relationship, the priority is, let's get together and get through this. With a transactional, it's like, let's, the two of us, figure out a way that we help each other. The trust one is more of a group effort. And adversarial, it's more, once I'm okay, then I'll think about helping somebody else. And for me, that's kind of how I would.
Steve, I want to thank you so much for the time that you spent today, the stories. I know there's a lot more. You've written a book. Steve, I want to thank you for this. You've written many of these stories and other stories like this from other industries into your book. So I'd like you to just show the audience.
This is the book. It's called The Supply-Based Advantage. I wrote it actually a few years ago, but it's amazing how much of this material is relevant today, because the human side of the business is continuing to evolve. And I think this book did capture a lot of stories from a lot of places, kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly kind of stuff. I think it's still relevant today.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. It's been a real pleasure having you here for one of our Trust Talks, and I look forward to doing some more in the future.
I'll be happy to do it. Great. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you, Steve.
We'd like to thank you for joining us for this Trust Talk. Please stay tuned for more Trust Talks featuring experts in trust building, collaborative leadership, innovation, and collaborative capitalism. The Institute is dedicated to bringing you the best insights, practices, and programs that help build your organization's ability to perform at world-class levels. If you seek to have a senior consultant help with implementation, our partner, the Warren Company, will work with you in the trenches. Here are a few programs the Institute provides. We look forward to you joining us for our next Trust Talk.